Hello, good morning again, and welcome back. This is session 2 of the Digit Leader 2020 Virtual Summit. And in this session, we're going to be considering how the challenges and expectations facing industries are changing and really forcing organizations to adapt, sometimes with a speed that, say, 4 or 5 months ago would have been barely credible. And I would imagine we're also going to be taking a look at the future of work and this whole phenomenon of remote working. Our first speaker, and bear in mind that once all 3 speakers have spoken, we're going to have a Q&A session. You can put your questions in at any time to any of the speakers, and just use the facility at the bottom of your screen. Is Richard Marshall. Richard is a technology analyst and principal at ConceptGap, and Richard's going to be talking about structuring the future enterprise.
Okay, thanks, Mark. This is session 2, as we said, and I'm talking about structuring the future enterprise. Like Robert, I am a former Gartner analyst, and I've been working from home for a very long time. In fact, I usually say I can't remember how long I've been working from home for. And I'm fortunate that I have a lovely office of my own up in the attic, separated off, so I sit in a comfortable position. But my belief is that working remotely is going to become it will become an option for everybody, if not the only option for many, many people. And we're seeing a lot of this happen. And what I really want to talk about in this quick session here is about how do we make that happen? How do we enable that? And what do we need to do to ensure that our businesses continue operating in that space? And it's worth going back to Gartner. The vast majority of Gartner people actually work from home. Well, the analysts do anyway. And that's been operating for a very long time. And there's a lot of other organizations that have been doing this as well. So I view the current pandemic as an accelerator to many trends that were happening in industry, especially the software industry. If you look at a company like GitLab that has 1,400 employees, it has no offices, it has never had an office, it's been 100% working from home. And it's really interesting to look at how they structure things. It's very interesting to look at the fact that they've documented everything, and that's actually fundamental to the way that they work. So they have a remote working manifesto that's a very good read, freely available online. And it talks about transparency and trust and how you can actually get stuff working better. And there's a couple of things that are probably worth picking up on in the world of remote. Remote doesn't necessarily mean working from home. It could mean working in different time zones, and it can also mean working from different locations. And so coffee shops being a classic example, and I think we're going to see an explosion of different ways of working emerging. And one of the things that I found absolutely fascinating during the pandemic is how you can see the nimble organizations out there, the agile organizations, and I don't mean agile in the technology sense, I mean businesses that are agile, switching models. So those of you who are based in Edinburgh might recognize that's a cake from Nice Times, also known as Love Crumbs. Top right is a very wonderful bread from 12 Triangles. Now, these are organizations that were coffee shops and bakeries, but a wholesale business, but principally selling out retail. And within days, they had organized themselves into the ability to deliver remotely. And very good it is too, being able to get wonderful cakes delivered to the house. Bottom right is Access Parkour delivering exercise classes and parkour classes by video, which is something a lot of people know about. Now, as we were just talking before this session, Mark was telling me about his wife who teaches horse riding, and they've gone virtual as well, using Bluetooth headsets, somebody holding the camera near the horse and being able to provide feedback remotely. And that is a fantastic example of reinventing yourself, which is driven by the necessity to keep engaged and the necessity to keep engaged with your customers, your staff. And that nimbleness is something that large organizations tend to lose as they get bigger, partially through ego, partially through lack of trust. And that the lack of trust and structure is actually something that we inherited all the time ago in the Industrial Revolution. When we moved off the land and into the factories, people put in place structure. So you were being told what to do, and the concept of the org chart emerged. And it was more about putting in time. It was about being at your workstation. It's being at your machine, sitting in the counting house. It was far more important than what you actually produced. And if we look into pre-industrial revolution, it's really interesting to see that most work was done by measuring your output. And we can see that today in Scotland with people like Harris Tweed Weavers, who are selling cloth by length. And it's a very interesting way of looking at things. And one of the trends that's been happening before the pandemic hit, and is going to be accelerated by it, is the move away from putting people into slots and org charts and being told what to do, and moving into the form of a team. So this is a concept of a team that has a bunch of skills in it, and we have to balance out that team. And we can think of it as people dropping in and out as providing the services within that team, not necessarily being part of an organization. Now, they all do work for an organization, they're being paid by it, but they are being looked at as people delivering things in the way that we used to do before we came into being measured by the number of minutes you put in at your desk. And I think this is very fundamental to the way that we can restructure organizations, is not thinking about clocking in at a certain time and clocking out. It's not about surveillance. And I pick up on the points from the previous speakers about the fact that surveillance is a really bad idea. Destroys any form of trust that existed between employees and employers. And what we really need to do is start looking at how do we build out these balanced teams, and balanced in terms of soft skills and hard skills. And we have a lot of technology here, but it's been sitting there, hasn't really been used terribly much over the years, because it breaks the model. And one of the things that I think is super important is this concept of trust. Now, I know that Carolyn is talking about trust in her session, so I'm not going to talk too much about this, but you may have come across this concept of radical trust. And radical trust is really about being open. It's about relying on people to do the right thing and to be responsible. And in the work context, this often means assuming that people actually want to do their jobs and do their job properly. And that requires trust to work in both directions. And it's very, very important that management lets people get on with it and provide the structure. Now, maybe we could say trust but verify. It's nice to know what people are doing, but you don't want to micromanage it. And it's really interesting, going back to GitLab with its manifesto for remote working and various other manifestos out there about how to work together. And it really comes back to this notion that we're working together. We're not here to work for the man, put the hours in. And that doesn't strike me as being terribly radical. It's just how you build a good team. And a theme that I picked up on last time I was talking at Digit Event was that's leadership, not management. Management is about being all over people and counting things. And leadership is about inspiring people to do the right thing and understand what the right thing is. And that comes over. And we have a fantastic opportunity at the moment with the pandemic to change how we communicate with people, to be honest about it. And one of the things I love is this whole issue of kids coming in, breaking into meetings. It makes people more human. And if you're a manager and you're like to check in on everybody at 9 o'clock in the morning and check in at 5 o'clock and see that they're still all working and not still wearing their pajamas, and it's a fantastic opportunity to actually demonstrate your humanness. And if your kids come running into the meeting and ask you something, that's well and good. It shows you're a human being. It shows you got kids. Now, this is something about building that trust and changing the relationship. Now, again, none of this stuff is new. And I was intrigued to know that there's people giving away Lego. I love Lego. Now, this slide represents the 11 paradoxes of management as determined by Lego. And if you ever get the chance to go to the Lego house in the city centre of Billund, not Legoland, but this beautiful, amazing building in the middle of the city, they tell you the whole history of Lego and how it established its position, how it nearly lost it, and how it got back. And they have set up these paradoxes of management. And I think that they summarize very, very nicely how you can work remotely successfully. And I'm not going to read through any of this. I'm happy to send this to anybody if you want to get in touch. Share the slides or whatever. These are fundamentally how you should make things work. So I'm just going to take that second one is that you need to lead, but also be in the background. And that really sums up how you should be working remotely. And that takes me on to the next point, which is, I'm paraphrasing Bill Gates. Bill Gates famously said, we need banking, but not banks. And yes, we need management. We need to know how long something took. We need to know how much it cost. We need to know when it's going to be ready. But we don't necessarily need managers. And I think that one of the huge changes that we're going to see as we come out of the pandemic and we move into what I call restart and prosper, other people call it rebound or reset, a lot of thinking out there. I think we're going to see a huge reduction in the level of managers. And I used to work with somebody who always used to talk about Mr. Managers, and that kind of sums it up. What we need are leaders, and not everybody has natural leadership. You can learn how to do natural leadership, you can, but it's something where there are a number of tools out there. And one of the things I find quite fascinating is looking at all of the different personality assessment tools that are out there. And one of the best ones from my perspective is a thing called the Clifton Strengths Finder, which assesses you against 4 major groups: executing, influencing, relationship building, and strategic thinking. Now, this happens to be my actual Strengths Finder relationship mapping. You'll notice achiever, futuristic, ideation, strategic, activator are my key strengths. Now, one of the things that works here is that you look at the ones that you choose to strengthen, and you don't really bother about navigate because they reckon that 10 is enough for you to be balanced. So why is this important? It's because when we're building those teams that I mentioned about earlier, so moving away from structure and org charts into building teams, we need to actually find the right balance across these different groups. And we can use these tools to look at the people that we're working with and establish, how can we build a team that will trust each other? How can we build a team that will deliver? How on earth are we going to do that? Well, we can measure this stuff right away. This stuff's available online, and there's a couple of very good books about it. There's a lot of research online out there as well. So I think that we have the tools, and we have a huge opportunity to stand back and think. Now, one of the wonderful things I picked up from an industry analyst called Josh Bersin, who works in the HR space and learning space, and he was talking about take the opportunity of not being super busy and not growing crazy speed to stand back and what he described as do a Marie Kondo on your business processes and your systems. Marie Kondo is the person who said, declutter your house by looking at things, and if the item doesn't spark joy, throw it out. Same thing with processes. If you've got processes out there that people don't use or don't need, get rid of them. Lighten up the process. Let the building, the organization become more agile so that you can innovate and look at different ways of doing things. Now, again, none of this stuff is easy. So one of the things that I looked at was, how do we plan out 100 days to structural change? 100 days is a concept. It doesn't mean this is actually going to take 100 days. So I broke this down into the 4 phases of you discover, build, and refine. So phase 1 is about understanding yourself, and this is particularly targeted at people who are leaders, managers, particularly C-suite people who have to provide that executive sponsorship for all of these kind of changes. And open your mind, listen, and develop confident vulnerability. Now, I think it was Robert who talked about that, creating safe spaces for people. Creating safe spaces for people requires you to develop the safety yourself. Confident vulnerability, look it up. It's a great thing to learn about. It's the ability to say, I got it wrong. It's about allowing people to admit to their mistakes and not punish them for them. And the other thing is to avoid presenteeism. Presenteeism is a great term. I love it. It's about people who worry that if they can't see their staff working, that they're not working. And I've come across a few people like that. You have to relax and assume that they're doing. And it doesn't matter whether they work overnight, get up at 11 in the morning and work till midnight, or if they get up at 5 and work till 2. It doesn't really matter, as long as they're producing the output and they're available when they need to be, if they have to talk to somebody. So phase 1 is about fixing yourself. Phase 2 is about discovering what's out there. It's about seeking where the sharp edges are. It's a little bit of that Marie Kondo stuff. You've got to go and identify how your business works and introspect on how that business works. So look at the skills profiles and see, where is stuff rigid? Where is somebody going to say no rather than yes in your organization? And build out agile rituals around it. Rituals meaning here meetings and reports and stuff like that. They're going to be different from when you were working in office, and this is an opportunity for structural change. And back to this concept of measuring output, you need to have metrics for that. So don't measure the number of hours that are logged, measure what their output is. Now, the third phase of this is to try stuff by training and learning. One of the big things that we've seen is a huge increase in investment in learning platforms, training, and understanding how to do stuff. Now, I created a concept earlier this year of a hierarchy of needs around remote working, which starts off with, does your Wi-Fi work? Does your broadband work? Do you have a computer that doesn't collapse every few minutes? So you build up from that to establish trust and other things, all the way up to looking after mental health. And that's a good guide. Again, happy to share that with anybody who's interested. And this build process is about finding the right balance. Maybe once lockdown is over, you meet once a month, once a week in common space. You don't have to go back to an office, because one of the big things is that offices aren't going to be the same. They're going to be very cramped. And finally, you have to take a lot of that stuff and you need to refine it, build a trust dashboard, and understand what's out there. Fix things that are broken. Try stuff. If it breaks, doesn't matter, come back and fix it. Continuous refinement is the model. So I'm Richard Marshall. I'm from ConceptGap. I'm based in Edinburgh. I'm a member of the Analyst Syndicate, which is a bunch of interesting ex-Gartner people who work together. And we're specifically looking at the future of work. So that's me. So I'm going to hand back to Mark.
Richard, thank you very much for that. Whilst I 100% agree with you that your kids appearing in the back of shots while you're actually trying to do a business call does make you look more human, it will not take those children terribly long before they realise the extreme power they have, and they will use that to bargain and negotiate without mercy. Now, our next speaker, this is interesting because I think as a species we have evolved to deal with each other face to face. You can see physical clues, you can look into somebody's eyes, you can smell them if necessary. We can't do that nowadays. That became apparent, over telephone calls, which again is just one step removed. Then you've got internet. There's a reason why most scams actually take place on those two platforms. There is an issue with trust and transparency. And our next speaker, Carolyn Jameson, is Chief Legal and Policy Officer for Trustpilot. And that's precisely what she wants to talk about, trust and transparency in the digital age.
Thanks, Mark. Good morning, everyone. So, yes, I'm here today to talk to you about trust. Now, clearly, this is something that we hear referred to a lot nowadays, and particularly, as Mark just did, in the context of consumers being online and technology. But it's often something that we don't really take the time to think about a lot. And certainly in the role that I've now taken on at Trustpilot, I think about it every single day. And I think at the minute, it's a particularly important thing to just stop and think about, because as we've seen through this pandemic, there's been a huge increase in the amount of e-commerce. Businesses are having to move online. So I don't think this is something that's going to go away. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard of her, but there's a fantastic lady called Rachel Botsman who has spent a lifetime studying and writing about trust specifically. And this is her, and she essentially talks about an evolution in trust and the impact that technology has had on trust. And this model is what she uses to describe that evolution. Now, essentially, society has moved from a situation where we relied on what she calls local trust. And by this, she means smaller networks of people, reputation-based communities, and we would tend to deal with people that we knew, or if it wasn't someone we knew, they would certainly not be very far removed from our personal network. And from that, we then moved to what she refers to as institutional trust. And this really came about with mass urbanization. And as communities, you couldn't know everybody anymore who lived in your community. We started to rely more on an upward flow of trust, in the sense that we looked to leaders, experts in certain areas, large corporations, and professional middlemen like lawyers and insurers, people like that. And it allowed us to then engage with a broader group of people and yet still feel that we trusted them. And companies in this sort of era grew largely through traditional advertising and traditional forms of brand protection like trademarks. And from that came the evolution of digital technology, as we all know. And this is Rachel here in the picture. And she now takes us to what she calls distributed trust, as you'll have seen before. And this is where she talks about trust flowing laterally. So individuals who we've never met before, and basically being assisted through online platforms and systems that indicate trust, like ratings, and companies growing through word of mouth and referral from large online networks. But as she says here, we've entered an era where individuals trust each other also in situations that we might never have expected, like getting into cars with strangers or renting accommodation from strangers. And she refers to this as taking a trust leap, which I really like. I think it really does present a picture around what we're doing when we engage online in these sorts of ways. And when you think about it, it is really strange. In the physical world, it takes us time to build up trust with another person, as Mark just said. We spend time together to figure out whether we like them or whether we believe what they're saying to us. We might talk to other people that know them. But when we're in an online environment, it's really difficult to look for that sense of reliability or confidence in a particular outcome that I think really is what trust is about. And perhaps naively now, looking back, we've perhaps become rather accepting, and companies online have become very adept at designing for trustworthiness. And I think this is what we're really talking about when we refer to product-led companies in a consumer context. Technology now gives us trust signals that we would have seen when we dealt with people in a real life scenario. And it's had the effect of really speeding up those relationships for us. And we're very quick to share personal details, provide user-generated content, or provide payment information. And I think particularly if people feel that they're getting something for that, we're very quick to do that. And unfortunately, the unintended consequences of that are now becoming very visible. And we've all seen the various scandals that have broken out in recent times, Facebook being one of them. But do we honestly think that these companies have deliberately set out to get into these positions? I personally don't, but I do think that trust online creates power. For companies that really have managed to achieve that with consumers, they have significant power. And through the information that we're giving them, it means that innovators, they want to keep innovating. So we provide all this information and insight, and they start to look to use it in different contexts. And what context that weren't perhaps originally intended. And I think we then end up in these very difficult situations. And we've now reached a point where, amplified by sort of the distrust that has grown within institutions, people are actually taking fiction as fact online and on social media. And it's now at the point where it's actually being used to influence world events, as we've seen with situations like Brexit, world elections. And it's huge. And it's really made people sit up and take notice, because it's actually calling into question the foundation of our democracy, essentially. And distributed trust, which we've all been relying on, as Rachel talks about, is now facing a crisis. We can see the huge impact in these statistics that these sorts of situations are having on general consumer protection of digital platforms. And it's deeply concerning. And not because of the impact on platforms, but because of the impact a total lack of trust online would actually have. we have a huge reliance on the money that companies make online. And if we didn't have that, we'd be in a very different position. And I think that already in Europe, we recognise that we're probably behind where we should be against the US and China in terms of the emergence of successful technology companies. Now, of course, there are multiple reasons for that, including access to finance and education and skills and legal barriers that we have. But we certainly don't need another one in the form of a lack of consumer confidence coming into play. Now, whilst I might have sounded fairly gloomy, I think, up to now, it actually presents a huge opportunity for us all as we move forward, probably accelerated through coronavirus and the move to greater e-commerce. And the result of any crisis is that change tends to come from that. And I think it's probably better to think of it as a potential further evolution. Now, there's never going to be a single bullet to protecting trust, clearly. And to solve this trust crisis. And it will require a spectrum of events and things to be thought about. But technology is clearly going to remain key to solving this problem and using that to create, but rather than sort of perhaps using technology in a different way and thinking about how we use it to actually protect trust more, and companies looking at technology to do that specifically, so that they can build greater reliability for consumers on the content that they see online. Distributed ledger technology, for example, which allows individuals to share select information in a way that creates a permanent record and a single source of truth as to what happened. Or using AI and data to more reliably spot patterns of behavior, for example, and spot networks that are working together through those large volumes of data to improve fraud detection, whether it's in the field of sort of counterfeit goods online or fake reviews online. Legislation is definitely playing catch up, as always. But the increasing visibility of the unintended consequences of technology and platforms is certainly creating a real drive in this area. And we're certainly keenly awaiting the outcome of the Digital Services Act consultation and the new legislation that will come in next year, which seeks to address really where responsibility should lie for content on platforms. And obviously the balance to strike here is a very difficult one, actually. And certainly in the role that I've now got, I've really, really seen what this means for businesses and how tricky this is. But given the number of platforms that exist as well and the different types of businesses, it will make it very hard for legislators to find the right balance between creating hurdles that would make it impossible for new entrants into this sort of area, into creating new online platforms and to meet the new needs that we'll have as consumers, but also appropriately protecting consumers, which is very important, but protecting also their freedom of speech, which was what the internet was all about, essentially. So we need to remember that as well. And then regulators, who also have a significant part to play in this, but thinking about how platforms abuse their position of dominance when they get that. Also having the ability to act very quickly where they see that, which has been lacking up till now, to be quite honest about it. And also considering more carefully and trying to think with an eye on the future as well about the combination of certain platforms when mergers appear. Because back to my previous point, it's not necessarily looking at the isolated data that different companies have or insights they have, but it's about what they could do with that in combination and making sure that we think that's the right thing really for consumers. And it is really back to this concept of what's the right thing. And certainly in the new proposed Digital Services Act, they're now very much talking more about this sense of responsibility that businesses should have, which I think is quite an interesting concept. But for individual companies, as I said, I think the opportunity that this evolution brings is also extremely significant. Some statistics here again from Salesforce: 54% of consumers currently don't trust companies to act in their interests. So the opportunity to really surprise consumers here by thinking holistically and doing the right thing, I think, is immense. And for the companies who get it right and manage to build trust with their customers and consumers, you can see here from these numbers the huge impact that would have for them, and huge potential in economic terms there is for companies here. We can see increased loyalty, increased referral, and increased purchase, which obviously just ultimately ends up in the bottom line. So it's brilliant. And you can also see here how it amplifies across age groups, which is another factor to really think about. And certainly can even have a greater impact in the generation that have been just much more willing to provide information and trust online. But in thinking how we approach this as individual businesses, again, I don't think there will be a single silver bullet here. But to be perceived as trustworthy as a brand, I think there are multiple things that companies will now need to start thinking about and thinking about more holistically. So most essentially, I think there's an element here around capability, and so competence and reliability. That's the basics that you need to be perceived as trustworthy. So do what you say on the tin, deliver the basics that you promise in a commercial sense, and that goes a long way. But then on top of that, don't forget the other elements. Show that you care and that you have integrity in everything that you do through your business. So how you treat employees. We've seen Amazon come unstuck there, for example. The values that you adopt as a company, we saw Uber come unstuck there, and how you encourage your employees to really treat each other. And then also think outside your own company. So we've talked about CSR for a long time, but people really want to see those sorts of the things we might have thought about in the context of CSR running through your whole business. So think about your supply chain, making sure that you are reducing carbon footprint as much as you can as an organization, and really showing that you're thinking more broadly about others. So looking to the future a bit and just sharing some of the insights that we certainly see at Trustpilot, I think there are some really important tips and points to note. So the first thing that we really see is it's not about being perfect. So imperfect is the new perfect, as it says here. People value authenticity and transparency far more than perfection. It's the companies that have owned the mistakes that they've made, that have come out of some of the crises that they've seen, and are doing better. We saw Uber did do that. They made a change. They brought in a new CEO who very openly talked about the problems they had and owned those. And we've seen Facebook hiding, refusing to go to hearings, things like that. And the impact on them is now far more significant, I would say, longer term. So just try and, when the inevitable breach of trust arises, which it will, it's about how you handle that more than anything. And then transparency. Transparency and trust are very often talked about together. But actually, they're almost mutually exclusive in some sense, because transparency isn't really akin to trust. It just reduces the need for trust. So trust becomes less important if you're more transparent, because that will earn trust inevitably, and people can make their own judgments around that. And at the basis of trust is a more confident relationship. And what transparency gives you is the ability to have a very confident relationship with your consumers. This is one of our slides around companies that get the Trustpilot rating, but in any rating or review platform that you might be using, getting your reviews in the right way has become far more critical than how many stars a company has. So things that we've seen, and that we've seen a lot of criticism for in the review space, has been being selective about who you invite to give feedback. That's not going to be a very clever idea anymore. Similarly, paying people to leave feedback or influencing somehow is also not going to be a very clever way to go about this anymore. And actually what we see is that people are less inclined to use companies that have all 5 stars. What they really want to see is how companies respond to issues as they arise, how they respond to review platforms or to reviews that have been left for you, and how you might respond on that platform. And finally, really, I think it will reach a point, I would predict, where every company is going to need some form of trust ecosystem. And I think if you don't have that, even now, particularly after we've seen situations arising in coronavirus times with fake information, fake things that you can buy, fake testing kits, all those sorts of things. I think if you don't have a trust ecosystem, you're losing out. But particularly, I think what we'll see is a growing desire for an independent trust ecosystem. What a lot of platforms have done up to now is build their own trust ecosystem, and we've seen the huge amounts that of criticism that Amazon has had for the level of fake reviews that are suspected to be on their platform. And I think the value will come really from trying to get that independent verification. Thank you very much. And I look forward to taking any questions during the session there.
Carolyn, thank you very much for that. That's very kind. Can I just remind you that there will be a Q&A session at the end of this when we've heard all three speakers. If you just go to the bottom of your screen, there's a facility there whereby you can post a question and we will try and get through them. Thank you very much. Our next speaker works for the Singularity Lab. He's the Director of Human Capital, and Puneet Sachdev wants to talk about the future of work.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking the time out to be here today. Thank you, Digit, for this opportunity and for all the work that you and your team have had to do in order to pivot to this virtual platform. And, I've had the pleasure of interacting with Pete and Hannah right from the get-go. They've been excellent in so many ways, very patient with me, so I just wanted to personally thank them as well. My objective is to bring to your attention some key trends that are shaping the way we are beginning to work, although Richard and Carolyn have mentioned a bunch of those things. What lies ahead and what is the role of us as leaders. And my aim is to leave you with a few critical insights that you can use to explore within the context of your organizational performance as a different invitation to succeed. Should you have any questions beyond today, I'll be more than happy to answer them for you. Now, Singularity Lab, we are an integrated human capital consultancy. Clients tend to be a lot of technology companies, but not all of them exclusively. Our aim is to deliver distinctive and lasting improvements, business results, designing excellent solutions around human capital to create high-performing workplaces and cultures. And often our solutions blend employee-centered design, workflow automation, and analytics. So from there, moving on to my talk track for today is going to be the future of work, the two important supporting themes around future of work, the role of leadership, and a couple of tools which we can utilize for insights. So here we go. Let's have a look over here. Now, we are in what is being defined as the fourth industrial revolution, a way of describing the coming together of digital, physical, and biological systems. At work, AI and automation, robotics are making the shift as significant as the mechanization did in the prior generations around agriculture and manufacturing. And for the last 2 centuries, we've also seen prognostications of how automation will destroy jobs. However, that's not really been the case. We've continued to prosper, and the show will really go on. Although I firmly believe what we will see is a period of significant dislocation as automation impacts work. It causes people to move from one profession to another, from one industry to another. But over a period of time, greater value will be created as, we can see, that's a McKinsey stat over there. By 2025, additional value of $3.7 trillion. It may have taken a knockback because of COVID, but cannot be significantly off that number. Out of these, one particular key trend that I would like to bring your attention to is the uberization of work. So work is going to involve many different types of arrangements, as the job, which is about 150, 200-year-old construct, is going to, over a period of time, cease to become the dominant way in which we work, right? A few decades ago, we began to see work escaping the organizational boundaries with the outsourcing phenomena. Today, we are seeing a dramatic and radical shifting in how work is being done. Work is escaping the confines of a job, getting rapidly deconstructed, automated, and transformed in ways that we could never have imagined. And in addition to the automation through AI, machine learning, uberization of work is the act of taking a job, pulling it apart into discrete tasks, and then dispersing it anywhere in the world where it makes more sense. So it's really moving away from the notion of a person in a job towards matching tasks to skills on a much more fast-moving, volatile, and plentiful basis. Now, by some estimates, this approach of deconstructing jobs, dispersing tasks, and automation can deliver savings of between 50 to 80%, of course, context dependent, which is a far cry from outsourcing, which is about 20 to 30%. Now, while automation will not wipe out, a ton of jobs, but what it will do is it's going to impact tasks, right? So it will become increasingly important for the HR teams to begin to look at work at a very elemental task level, to reconstruct them into activities that are routine versus one-off, activities that are physical versus mental, activities that are getting done individually or collaboratively. And then, with these activities, we have to ask ourselves, what do we want from this activity? Do we want precision and zero error, or do we want higher productivity? So asking these kind of questions it is not really until we get to this elemental level that we will be able to really understand how automation technology and alternative sources of working can be applied to tasks. And alternative sources of working means gig economy, automation, outsourcing, contractors, volunteers, all of that stuff, right? So, and McKinsey estimates about, as of today, 40% of tasks can be automated within jobs, but only a total of 5% jobs can be automated. So that's a bit about, just overall what's happening with the uberization of work and the automation. I'm going to touch upon a bit about the two trends, the two important themes which really feed into or which support this way of working, this disparate way of working. One is remote working. Richard has spoken, he's spoken a bit about it. I'll touch upon a few things which he's mentioned and also some additional patterns, as well as diversity and inclusion, and more inclusion than diversity. It's simply because there is a greater need for flexibility, and with the uberization of work, anyway, there has been a requirement of people wanting to work remotely for some time now. And as a saying goes, that if you don't have a wolf at your door, go rent one. COVID has certainly done that in terms of making us adapt to remote working and automation like nothing else has ever before. Being in a global marketplace at a greater scale, unifying culture will be a glue to holding this permeable kind of organization together. And inclusion is going to be a very key important tenet to that. So let's have a look at remote working as to, what are some key areas that you could look at to create your remote working playbook. And it's the reason to do that is to clarify expectations and set standards. When we work with clients to create remote working playbooks, these are the usual areas that we delve into: tools, rules, and norms. How will technology be used? What's okay? What's not okay? For example, is it okay to switch off our cameras when we are in a meeting? So all of that get covered in tools, rules, and norms. Then spaces and routines, supporting employees, giving them guidance on how they can create workplaces at home, how they can create routines and practices to stay focused. Trust and relationship, Carolyn has spoken a fair amount about it. A lot of this within an organizational context is going to come down to leadership, the communication, the role modeling of behaviors, and also really creating those water cooler moments, which are so important for the informal cohesion to continue. That could come through things like virtual coffees or starting meetings maybe 10 minutes early and giving everybody the time to talk about their latest, Netflix binge or their COVID hairstyle or some weird habit that they've picked up, right? Resilience is another area, importantly, looking at it 3 different levels: individual resilience, organizational resilience, and technological resilience. How are we going to manage that? And wrapped up all around this is culture. How can we keep our culture intact? How will we culture board new joiners? What does living our values look like now that we are working in a remote team? So these are going to be some critical pieces to look at as you refine your playbook, your remote working playbooks. And, not to really underestimate, one of the most critical pieces is going to be communication. We are dealing, employees are dealing, everyone is dealing with a fair amount of uncertainty. Open, honest communication is really going to be important. And I think that's what Carolyn spoke about. It's really, people don't want perfect. They would like to know what the truth is. And this is exactly what I'm alluding to as well. So as leaders, we name emotions and struggles that we are dealing with in a way to humanize the remote working experience, that you are implicitly in that way giving the employees and the others the permission to speak about them aloud, right? It works in favor of establishing psychological safety, which is required, again, to speak openly, to be about uncomfortable emotions, the stresses that people are feeling within work and outside of work as well. And if you lay that all into the context of remote working, it just becomes doubly important. So these are a few quick ideas around remote working. The next important theme really is diversity and inclusion. Given that, given that we are working in this world, we've got people from all over. And I feel that this quote over here from Brené Brown really brings it to the essence very well, the bottom line of who we are as human beings and why inclusion really matters. So it does make business sense as well, and I'll back it up with some numbers over here. So, talking about diversity, it's about representation. It's a numbers game largely. And a lot of organizations are beginning to get this right, and they are seeing a significant impact on their performance. However, it's really inclusion, which is its elusive cousin. It's the behaviors and the social norms that ensure, whether it's Simone or Saida, whether it's Roger or Ranjit, they really all feel welcome and they have equal access to the resources and the opportunities. Now, this really has to be in the water of the company, in your culture DNA, and that too very, very publicly. It's not easy because many of us have unintentional biases that we do not know about, but there are ways to work around it. And again, once again, the context is such a global work. We're all over the place. How do we keep ourselves connected, unified? How do we get the best out of people? How do we harness that human potential? And really, inclusion is going to be key for that. Some data from McKinsey over here stating the uptake of diversity within organizations and beginning to have a look at the bottom line impact. However, social listening paints a very different picture for inclusion. The sentiment around diversity is 52% positive, and it's only 29% for inclusion. And if you were to really slow this down, what does this really mean in an unseen organization, i.e. remote working, etc., even if you're seen? This really means that many, many people, and not restricted just to ethnic minorities, many people within organizations are not really having a fulfilling experience. They feel restricted to express who they really are for the fear of non-inclusion. And the fact also is, we don't have to kid ourselves, because we know that every rejection is felt and every exclusion is registered. It's just that as adults, we become really sophisticated at numbing ourselves and walking around with a mask. And some of us have done that so long that when the mask is removed, the face is not even there. And that has an impact. That has a knock-on impact on your organization. Global marketplace, once again, what kind of an impact can that have on your customer interactions, for example, right? If we are not an inclusive organization internally, if we are not an inclusive people within our communities and societies, little chance that we're going to be inclusive externally with our potential customers and customers. So inclusion at the first place is really, first of all, something is a leadership problem. I think it has to be addressed at that level to then make it real and concrete in terms of progress within organizations. So yeah, just one more quick example. Inclusion really is like watering the roots of the tree, where the whole organization blossoms in its own unique expression. So from there, coming on to the role of leadership, gosh, this is beginning to feel like a bit of an underwater lab. Like, going at a rapid pace to complete everything. Right, here you go. So role of leadership, I'm going to look at two aspects over here, the leadership team and the head of human resources. So what does it really mean for all of us in the room today? As leaders, we shape the context and we bring the future into the present. Something you will play a key role is in creating and maintaining a unifying purpose and an inclusive culture as you engage with multidimensional, multi-generational, and multi-locational workforces. And this really is going to be very critical to the success of the organization. And you're going to be required to also create and manage permeable organizations, where one in which work and talent flows in and out seamlessly. Once again, culture again is going to be key here. This is Lena Nair. She's the CHRO for Unilever. Culture is the new organization structure. Of course, we're a disparate workforce. How do we keep it all together? How do we be many in body and one in mind? And that is really going to come down to the culture. And that is the buck stops with the CEO and the leadership team. Now let's look at what this means for your people operations. The role of the HR leader is beginning to look very different today. When I shared about in the future of work, I spoke about jobs. I mentioned about getting jobs down to the elemental task level to understand how automation, technology, and alternative sources of work can be applied to tasks. So who better than HR leaders to help business leaders navigate this new plurality of getting work done? Moving away from a job architecture to the architecture of matching skills to tasks, skills to projects, skills to multiple ways of getting work done, and to have that agile organization humming. So HR is not really going to be a soft operation anymore. You really cannot join HR if you want to get away to work from numbers and working away from data. In fact, right now, about 40% of the hiring that is taking place within the HR functions is around data and analytics. So that brings us into the tools that I spoke about, two tools which could really help you on this journey of creating a new and a different kind of an organization is people analytics. Within that specifically, I'm going to talk about organization network analysis. In case, especially if you're wondering how on earth do we measure ourselves on so many different hidden people parameters on inclusion, cultural engagement, collaboration, all of that stuff. So ONA is a very versatile tool. It sits within the domain of people analytics. It can provide a fresh lens on how work really gets done in a company. Richard showed in his slide, he showed the org chart, he showed the tree, and he showed the team, right? So when you're working in teams, work happens very, very differently. Now, there's less hierarchy, we're working remotely, more agile work practices. What comes into play for getting work done is social capital. And that's really hard to really figure out what's happening. Who are the key influencers? Who's doing the work? Who are our leaders? But ONA is this phenomenal tool which can provide you a great level of insight. It's very non-invasive. You do not have to ask anybody to fill out any questionnaires. It just simply uses the digital exhaust of your organization to generate and visualize some really great insights. Let me just show you some quick use cases over here. A number of questions you can answer. You can probe what are the levels of engagement now that people are working remotely. How well is the manager engaging with their teams? What is the level of collaboration between teams within IT, for example, or beyond IT, etc., technology? What is the risk of burnout of high performers? How gender inclusive are we? Who are the key influencers? What patterns do our top sales performers exhibit? Much more of this can actually be answered through ONA. And, it's not a very costly proposition as well, roughly between $20,000 or so. You could have an engagement which will help you answer at least 2-3 of these questions, which you can see on the slide over here. Now, just showing you some outputs. Here are some outputs. This is an organization undergoing transformative change. They wanted to identify the key influencers. They came up with a list of 800 managers. On the right-hand side, you can see what the ONA tool came up with, 300 managers, which much more denser network graphs for a deeper reach. And these 300 were not a direct subset of the 800 managers. Here is an example of gender inclusion ONA. The colors represent high, medium, and low, red being low levels of inclusion. And, here is an example of how men and women network differently. So you can also actually identify those who get promoted. How do they network differently? What are the patterns? And there are some stats around it. You can also do such an analysis for ethnicities, generations, and various other parameters. So as you can see, there's a lot which can be unearthed, which can be looked at analytically using data, so you can measure improvement and you can hold yourselves accountable for making needed movement on some really important unseen metrics, what used to be unseen metrics in the past. So that's one key tool. And the other tool, which I really believe liberates the human spirit like nothing else, is coaching. This is my very favorite because, I do coaching as well. I love it. And I spend a fair amount on my coaching. In fact, a good amount of money each year in hiring coaches and working with them for myself. So coaching, just imagine that you own a beautiful, let's say, Audi A7. It's a stunning car, isn't it? Undoubtedly, you're going to take that for servicing on a regular basis to make sure stellar performance continues. And yet here we are as human beings, infinitely more powerful than an Audi A7. We created the Audi A7. We created interstellar vehicles. Yet we do not take the time or create the opportunities for our leadership or the people in the organization to look under the hood and figure out what makes us tick. We do not take the time to remove the interferences and change the mental models for exceptional performance to emerge. It's almost like not running our own virus scan on our inner workings on our mind. Now, that's what really a high-quality coach can do. Somebody who's done a good level of deep inner work can help their clients reach depths they did not know existed, shift mental models, and liberate bands of light which are trapped within, thus liberating really extraordinary levels of performance. And all of this, as well as deep satisfaction in their life overall. And, all of this can take place in conversations. I know that because I do that, and I receive that too. In fact, Google did a study internally over 10 years, and they figured that what makes a significant impact on performance is coaching. Definitely highly recommended for those of you who haven't experienced it. I'm sure those of you who have are probably very much in rhythm of continuing with this. And with that, let me bring it all in for a landing. Here is a summary of what I have covered. And on the right-hand side, you can see some suggested actions, what you could take moving forward. If you have any follow-up questions, you're very, very welcome to get in touch. And, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay. This is Richard Morris. I was just going to step in while Mark's audio was there. I was just going to say that I think we had a fantastic alignment of our sessions there between Puneet, Caroline, and myself. And I think there was so many key common themes that came out of there that it was really, really interesting to see how much they aligned and how these trends are really beginning to come together. And I love the, if you haven't got a wolf at the door, go hire one. That's a great expression. I've not heard it before. There's a few questions down here that I thought we could start by asking quickly and then go on to more general descriptions. So I have a question from Ali Wright of Standard Life about examples of people who've used Clifton's strengths to pivot how they work. Unfortunately, I can't talk about specific examples because they're confidential, but there are a number of projects in and around central Scotland that are absolutely working with these things to build teams, get teams to work together. I mean, Clifton is just one of many different ones. I just happen to like it because it's very detailed and it points you at the key strength areas that you should really reinforce rather than trying to fix the ones that you're not very good at. There's a similar method for assessing companies, although not quite as comprehensive as the ONA that Puneet was talking about, which sounds really interesting. So yes, it does work. It's very interesting, and it should be part of anybody's introspection on self and others. So, Mark, can you hear us, or can we hear you?
Well, I could hear you throughout, to be honest, Richard, but I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Welcome back.
Hey, excellent. Good stuff. Thank you very much for jumping in. As Ray would say yourself, you're a diamond geezer, mate. Thanks for filling in on that. Much obliged. Carolyn, there's another question here from Richard Bradley, specifically aimed at you, saying that people are less likely to trust a five-star company and that they're perhaps looking at how companies deal with problems. What's been done to provide a rating system that shows trends? For example, the person says, if I receive a faulty product, I will rate it low. This might have been a one-off issue, and the company may subsequently go out of their way to replace the product. If I then up my rating, then the upward shift is typically not visible to others. Thoughts on that?
Yes, I think it's something that we'll see more of. Trustpilot actually does do that already. We have a page that you can go to for each company, which you can see how it's mapped out over time and things like whether they are complaining about every one-star review and other things that will help you make that judgment. Because ultimately, as a consumer, it's no good to just look at one element. You actually need to look at some of the information that goes behind that score for it to be truly useful. And I'm sure there will be others in time that will do that, but we certainly do.
You spoke about a trust leap. You know, I was thinking you actually referenced, I think, Uber at one stage. They go around that by basically, you know, if I book onto Uber, then they'll ping me, you know, a message on my phone, and it shows me the driver's face, it shows me the car registration number, the make, the model, the colour, everything else. There isn't really a trust leap there. They've kind of filled that gap. Can other companies do that effectively?
I think it depends on, for every type of platform, the trust gap will be different. And I know one of the companies that have been very good at talking about this was Airbnb, and the fact that they've designed to fill that trust leap, because historically we'd have all stayed in hotels because we felt comfortable with that. So they had a whole trust leap and trust gap to fill for us to make that trust leap in how they persuaded people to go and stay in people's houses. And I think for every type of platform, there will be a different gap to fill and a leap to take. I think Uber have done that very obviously because you're getting into a stranger's car. But I think others have done it in different ways. I mean, Amazon, when you put your payment details in, so I think there are lots of companies doing that, just the form is different.
Puneet, you were talking about the importance of coaching and inclusivity. This is a question from Peter Mackey, Forth Valley College. How are companies going to handle the hiring of people who are only just beginning to join the workforce? Much of the learning done by juniors is done within the workplace to help from people around them. How would workplaces integrate this in a remote environment? And can the same level of learning and training be done remotely?
Well, that's a fairly long question. So I think what I'm getting out of that question is the integration of the people who are graduating, how they're going to be integrated into organizations, what are the opportunities for them? Is that fundamentally the essence of the question over there, Mark?
Say that again. I'm sorry, that last bit, I missed it.
I said is the fundamental essence of the question is more around how are organizations going to be able to utilize those who are graduating, coming into workforce, and developing them? Is that really the essence of it?
I think so. Yeah, and it might not even be at graduate level.
Yeah, so I think there are multiple ways by which organizations are doing that right now. One is that, of course, they have their own internship and graduate programs. The other ways I see organizations doing that, they're opening up places for, volunteership. Sometimes it's paid, sometimes it's really unpaid. And that's a low-cost way for the organization really to see, but it also creates opportunities for the graduates to go and see if this environment works for them, does not work for them. So it just depends on multiple different factors, which part of the industry that you're going into. And as far as development is concerned, there are some organizations which are very well down the road, very sophisticated. They have their graduate development plans, pathways, they have mentorship, they have the whole leadership, they have the whole development track. Some organizations do it very ad hocly, very randomly. Okay, let's just do it. We need somebody to do this project in HR, to do the documentation. Let's get somebody on board. So it's a whole range of it. But at the top end of it, organizations which do it well, they have a proper methodology, they have a structure, they have their outcomes. You're assigned to buddies and mentors, and your outcomes are as important to the organization's outcome. If that's not answering your question, get in touch with me on LinkedIn and I can do a conversation with you.
Okay. Any thoughts on that, either Richard or Carolyn?
Well, I'd like to pick up on it in that I think this falls into the category of informal and frequent communication as well. I've been working with a company that delivers what they call Digital Hub, which allows people to push out lots of small micro-learning type things to people dynamically. And it's a very buzzy market at the moment because onboarding people is clearly something that's difficult. So there are learning solutions out there that people are using. So I've seen this. This was a training company. It was one of their clients who switched from fully face-to-face classroom-based learning to fully digital. And they used this informal thing to take people all the way through the process. So that's effectively starting a new job if you're a face-to-face trainer. And that worked. It was very successful. The other thing that I'd raise, which isn't an answer to the question, but it kind of expands on the question itself, is we've got a lot of people on furlough and people who have not been working for a while, and if we're bringing them back, reboarding them. Reboarding them is actually a really, really interesting process because if somebody's been disconnected for a while, how do you bring them back on effectively? And the best practice is definitely to keep talking to them, but it's a similar problem to the one you're describing because they're coming back to something new. So, these aren't easy things, but they are processes that people have mastered by adopting informal communication, very much the psychologically safe spaces, make sure people are ready to talk to them, make everything sort of bite-sized learnings, make it easy to access, all that kind of stuff. And there was an interesting point from somebody I know who recently started a job and was fully onboarded. And she said that it was easier being remotely onboarded than it was doing it face-to-face because you were meeting all these people who you would never actually work with in future. So you were setting up these relationships with the wrong set of people to begin with. And by being online, she was actually able to establish the relationships with the people she's going to be working with more quickly, which I think really talks to this notion of trust localities that Carolyn was talking about.
You want to pick up on that, Carolyn?
Yes. I mean, I think with all of these things, it's all about communication for me. Most things come down to communication, whether it's onboarding people, bringing people back, as Richard just said, and also building that trust. And it's just figuring out how to best communicate in these given situations, I think. Whether that's through, training, remote training that Richard was talking about, which is certainly something that we've been using as we've been onboarding people through these times, to just how you then make people feel part of that team. And we've seen, certainly in a working environment, lots of teams who now aren't together, just trying to do some small social activities, whether it's quizzes or whatever. And that's really all about communication and maintaining those relationships, I think.
It's an interesting one, Puneet, because we haven't really touched on this as yet, but I think there's a cadre of people out there who actually don't really want to be part of the team, who are perfectly happy working remotely and by themselves.
Yeah. Absolutely. I love working remotely. It's brilliant. And this actually takes us, could take us on to an interesting point, which is the disappearance of the commute. What's some really interesting figures appearing from New York City and California, the collapse of the number of fatalities due to vehicle incidents is enormous because nobody's commuting. And then, of course, I think we saw somebody earlier showed a picture of New Delhi. I mean, when I was last in New Delhi, I was fearful to go outside because the pollution was so bad. And now you can see the mountains in the distance. It's beautiful. So cutting back and commuting is a huge liberator of people's time and a massive thing that from a climate change point of view, and we've been talking extensively about the pandemic, but that is just one of many waves of impact that we're going to be coming through. And to pick up on the points of resilience that Puneet was talking about, resilience is going to be core because we've got a number of shocks coming, and many of which we don't know about yet. But we know of at least 2 major shocks that are coming towards us, and we need to build that resilience. And stopping the commute, get that time back, maybe use it for building new skills, things like that, is really important, as well as cutting out the carbon consumption or generation.
Puneet?
Yeah, I think, what Richard has said is so true, especially more so I feel that just the half-life of skills is dramatically, I mean, there's just, the shift is incredible. So it does create great opportunities in terms of learning and development, identifying what you can do. Number of companies, if you go to LinkedIn on a regular basis, there's so many free webinars happening today. You can learn a ton of it. So what's really going to be important is it's really a time to step back and see what is the impact of AI automation on your job, on your industry, and then asking yourself the question that how this is going to impact me, and what do I need to learn, and what kind of skills do I need to acquire? Now, in the context of people, organization development, like I said, today 40%, half of the hiring which is happening is around data scientists, analytics, etc., within HR. And HR is, it's going to be looking like another tech function, honestly, with the kind of technology with people analytics, what's happening. Richard, you cited Josh Bersin, and he's such a prolific researcher and writer on what's going on. If you follow any of his work, you will just see where the puck is actually at or where we're headed. So I think it's really critical for us as professionals to, number one, have a clear picture and a clear vision for ourselves of where we need to get to, and then use the opportunities which are present. A lot of them are free of cost right now to upskill, some you've got to pay for, etc.
Carolyn, in your presentation, you touched on 2 things, legislation and regulation. Legislation, I think, is an interesting one because, I'm thinking specifically about the Westminster government at the moment. They have this approach of, yes, people will use their common sense. That hasn't worked out terribly well.
No. I mean, a lot of people don't have common sense. We all have different strengths. But they make it sound like everybody has it, and it's not something that everybody has. And that's why it doesn't really work.
So how confident are you that you will get effective legislation? To basically to build on trust, to make things more transparent?
I'm not terribly confident. I think it will be helpful. The problem with legislation, in my view, is it really does struggle to cater for every scenario. It's very difficult to get something that works in every scenario. And what then happens is it's also always catching up, and it takes such a long time to get through that it might fix that situation for the moment, but how do you make that future-proof? And the only way you can do that is creating grayness in there to then enable people to make their own decisions. And as we just talked about then, the problem is that's fine if people either have the right common sense or they have the right motivation. And then once either of those things warp, then another problem bubbles up and you get these unintended consequences. I think what I tend to see is guidelines tend to work a little bit better, actually, where they don't have the same legislative strength, but they provide guidelines that then companies can have to work within. And then when they get caught for doing something they shouldn't, you would now hope that really the public scrutiny that we're now seeing of the companies that are getting caught, I mean, the impact on their business is just huge. If we look at Facebook in the last 2 weeks with the boycott of advertising that's going on because people don't believe they're doing enough to stop racist content getting onto the platform. I mean, that's huge. That will really be hurting their business. So I think it needs, as I said in my presentation, really, there's no silver bullet. Legislation has its place. Regulators have their place, and technology, but there's no single thing. It has to work together, really, to resolve the problems that we have.
Richard?
Well, I'm actually looking at Craig Stevenson's question about how do we ensure workers' rights in the future work environment, because I think that fits in exactly. It's a very, very good question, and this varies from issues around not having proper workspaces at home, which is relatively easy to fix. I say relatively because not everybody's got the space to build it, but I think we're going to see some very interesting new styles of furniture emerging. I've already seen people who are building fold-away office spaces so that you can shut them up at the end of the day and it's just a box on the wall the rest of the time, through to protecting people's rights in that gig economy. And to pick up on Puneet's point about the uberization and the breaking down, one of the things that the picture I had of the team and building that balanced team and picking up the people in it is that it's part of a much, much bigger process that looks at people's careers in a long-term manner. So it's how do you build the skills and how do you share people within projects? So classically, there are techie roles like testers who will work on multiple projects within one company, or graphic designers will spend a couple of days a week in each project. And how do we extend that model to look at the sort of gig work, but within a structured environment where people are protected? So it's not easy because there's a lot of pressure in all sorts of directions, and things like IR35 confusions don't help either. So I think that we really need some kind of, you could even imagine some concept around sort of a digital union, as it were, which is a means of protecting and measuring and assessing digital workers' rights and using a lot of the technologies we've looked at. Particularly thinking about Trustpilot. So you could imagine that Glassdoor is an interesting equivalent of Trustpilot for do you want to go and work for these people? And of course, the problem is being a whistleblower kind of marks you down later. So I don't have any silver bullets for this, but I do think it comes back to trust, being able to say very publicly what's happening to you and building out an environment where people have a structure around them. I'm not meaning Social Security here, but structure around their career, because decades of cutbacks in HR services, and it was interesting that Puneet was talking about HR as well, decades of turning HR into basically just protecting senior execs from breaking the law, which is frankly what HR does most of the time. It needs to turn back into something where you can help people and create a structure and help people, for example, those who've been furloughed and then are now being laid off. How do I adapt? How do I take what I've done? How do I expand it out of there? And I think this is all one big complicated ball of mud that we're going to have to kind of decide, tear apart and try and put it together. And I certainly don't have the answers for any of the legal sides of it. Legislation is going to be too slow. I do feel that trust is part of it, but I also think that there's opportunities there for automation, coaching services to not just have human coaches, but the ability for tools to help people find the right kind of coaching and look at things that they might otherwise not have looked at. So that's a big point for me, but I've been talking for a long time. So Puneet, I'll hand it over to you.
Right. Let's see. Yeah, so in terms of the contribution of the people, like the human people and culture team, I don't think the functions could operate anymore in the way you described them, Richard, that just being like tick box, keeping you safe, compliance. The organizations cannot operate like that anymore. It's so much more complicated. Whether it's remote working, whether it's the technology, whether it's the whole uberization of work, the leaders, especially the leaders, the head of human resources, have to have a very different skill set to succeed, and they almost really have to be. They've got to understand technology. They've got to understand business, numbers, so many different things. So that whole ballpark is already shifting. You're just seeing a different breed, a different league of chief people officers emerging. Many of them getting promoted to CEOs as well. So that's one thing which is happening. And I just want to tag on to that. There is a question over here around org trees. Like somebody asked a question that Richard showed this example of tree versus teams, and how do you transition senior executives who are used to their mental model is really that hierarchical structure. Now, in an ideal scenario, you would like the leadership of the organization or human resources to lead that. But if you do not have that, one of the ways which you could do this is really to run a pilot yourself. And if you can get a senior sponsor on that project of yours and say, we're going to try this out differently, it's a low risk way. You can just do it in one part of an organization. We're going to work as a different unified team. Here's going to be the objectives, and here is what. So then what you do then with that is not only do you track how the project has progressed, but also how the people have felt, etc., as well as having the senior sponsor being there with you. So that could be one way, which is low risk, to shift the boundary, shift the At the end of the day, it's all mentality, right? It's all mental models we are carrying which need to shift. And that's where really coaching comes in as well.
Carolyn, there was a question I was actually going to put to the first two speakers this morning, but I think it's relevant here too, which is because we are working remotely now, because we are not working face-to-face, and I'm not sure why that makes such a difference, but it does. I can see you, I can see your facial expressions, I can see your eyes, I can hear the timbre of your voice, all that kind of thing, but it's not as good as if I was actually face-to-face with you. The people who are administering, managing, dealing, being part of the team, you actually have to be better at soft skills remotely than you would have to be face-to-face.
100%.
Absolutely.
Any thoughts on that, Carolyn?
I think that's right, because you can't pick up on body language in quite the same way, which I think is part of the challenge remotely. So if somebody's upset, if they can hold it together kind of on their facial expression, you wouldn't necessarily notice their entire body. So I do think you have to be a bit more sensitive. And I think in terms of our future working, although I definitely think there'll be far less travel, far less commuting, all of that, I think some face-to-face time will remain important.
And that could be just simply people getting together, like a Friday evening, they get together, they work together at a location, they book out a co-working space, and let's meet on Friday. Because that's really important for the energetics to be in place, for the cultural aspect. I mean, what is fundamentally, all this is going to work. It swims in a certain body of water, and that is the culture. And all these things we're talking about, these are cultural aspects. These are what the leadership believes in and what the organization ingrains is going to make them effective or not effective and efficient. And that's where my point of actually inclusion comes in. It's such a fundamental requirement. As human beings, once we come onto the earth, we have this feeling we're not good enough anyway, right? And you complicate it further. We put ourselves in organizations, and now, like remote working, etc. So the role of leadership is got to be at a profound level, I think, today, to be able to create organizations which will stand the test of time, which are trustworthy, which really are, which are organizations, and they stand for something. Because today everybody can build their own economy, right? We do not need too much. We can build our own economy and hang out. But an organization, I feel, is something which moves humanity forward. And we need profound leadership for that, for these organizations to move us through.
Yeah. Can I pick up on the similar point here that James Sheehan has raised about the sort of perceived higher value face-to-face, which is a very different thing from the body language point of Carolyn. I think that the perceived value thing is transient. People will get used to it. It's seen as commitment and time. It will switch. just like we've seen many things switching. And one of the transitions, I would say, is when we've moved to the smoking ban, thank goodness, that happened more or less instantly. But there was a huge amount of resistance. But when it happened very, very quickly. And there's all sorts of other interesting examples, masks being one of them. But I just wanted to pick up on the remote thing. It is that you have to learn how to do it. When I was at Gartner, I had a team of people that were quite literally all the way from Oslo through to Hong Kong, including quite a few in the US. And some of it, especially a couple of the guys in the US, I had to have difficult conversations with them. And I had never actually met them. So it is possible. I'm not saying it's easy, but then having difficult conversations is by definition difficult. And you can, of course, if you're off camera, you can be fiddling with something and doing stuff that to relieve the tension that you might not otherwise be doing. But there are things that you can do that you just have to square up to it, and it happens. It's a learning experience. It's something you can train people to do. And I think that as we move away from regular travel and away into, I particularly agree with this concept of the sort of Friday rent out space. I see that as being the way that people will achieve that time to meet. I would also say that maybe this is just because I don't like pubs, but this whole social thing is that you don't go to work to socialize. You go to work. And I think that people are particularly missing the opportunity to socialize normally due to lockdown of their social lives, rather than the fact they can't talk to their colleagues, because there's lots of people who don't want to talk to their colleagues. So we do hear a lot of noise that is related to topics other than remote working. So it's things like kids not being in school and stuff like that, or furloughed partners who are at home who wouldn't normally be at home because their job involves manipulation. So I do think that there's a lot of transient stuff that we're seeing. And I would say the most important message about that is we've got to learn from it. We've got to take those lessons, see what we changed, why we changed, and see whether we stick with them, how we refine them as we go forwards.
Thank you very much for all those answers. And thank you if you submitted the questions for your questions too. Richard, Carolyn, and Puneet, thank you all. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to take a short break now, probably about 15-20 minutes, thereabouts. The next session will start at midday. There's going to be 4 breakouts. You can select one to attend. After breakouts, we're going to have lunch from 12:45 to 1:30. That's a really good time to explore the site, maybe look at some of the exhibitors, have a chat, basically get in contact with people as you would in an actual physical encounter. We've all got to get used to this kind of stuff. Just take a wander around the site, enjoy it. But right now, as I said, let's take a break. From me, Mark Stephen, thanks very much.